The small neighborhood diner was the kind of place where time moved slowly. The scent of fresh coffee floated through the air, and the soft clatter of dishes blended with quiet conversations between regular customers. It was supposed to be a peaceful morning, but in a single moment, everything changed. An elderly black woman sat quietly at a table near the window, sipping her coffee and minding her own business. Her gray hair rested neatly on her shoulders, and her calm presence carried the dignity of someone who had lived through decades of struggle and survival. Then a furious man stormed toward her table. Within seconds, the room fell silent. A loud slap echoed across the diner, shocking everyone inside. The elderly woman's glasses slid across the table as the man shouted angrily and demanded she leave. What he didn't know was that the woman he had just humiliated was the mother of one of the most powerful men in the city. And within minutes, everything in that diner would change. Before we continue, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel Black Legacy for more powerful stories like this. The diner sat on a quiet corner of the city, a place known more for its comforting food and friendly staff than for any kind of drama. It had been there for decades, long before the surrounding buildings turned into modern shops and offices. The walls were decorated with old photographs of the neighborhood from the 1970s and 1980s, reminders of a time when life moved slower and people knew each other by name. Many of the regulars had been coming there for years. Some came for the pancakes, others for the strong coffee, and many simply came because it felt like home. Among those regulars was Margaret Lewis, a 72-year-old woman whose quiet presence had become part of the diner's daily rhythm. Margaret carried herself with calm dignity. Her posture was straight, her movement slow but confident. She wore simple but elegant clothes, and her silver hair framed a face marked by both wisdom and resilience. Most people in the diner knew her simply as a polite elderly woman who enjoyed reading the newspaper while drinking coffee. They didn't know much about her past. They didn't know that Margaret had lived through some of the most difficult chapters of American history. She had grown up in a time when segregation still divided communities, when opportunity was something that often depended on the color of a person's skin. Life had not been easy for her family. Her parents worked tirelessly just to keep food on the table. But Margaret had always believed in something stronger than fear or bitterness. She believed in patience, dignity, and perseverance. Those values were what she passed down to her only son. Her son, Marcus Lewis, had grown up watching his mother struggle and sacrifice. He had seen the long nights she spent working multiple jobs just to make sure he had opportunities she never had, and he never forgot it. Marcus grew up with a powerful determination to protect his mother and change his future. But the world he entered as a young man was harsh and unforgiving. The neighborhoods around them were filled with crime, poverty, and danger. Many young men lost their way. Marcus did not start out intending to become powerful or feared. But life has a way of shaping people through the choices they make and the circumstances they face. Over the years, Marcus built connections, influence, and power in ways few people fully understood. Eventually, his name became one that people whisper with caution behind closed doors. Many knew him as one of the most influential figures in the city's underground networks. His organization controlled businesses, security operations, and powerful connections that stretched across the city. But despite his reputation, there was one person Marcus never allowed to be touched by that world: his mother. Margaret never asked questions about her son's life. She simply believed he had become successful and respected, and Marcus made sure she lived peacefully, far away from the darker parts of his empire. To Margaret, he was simply her loving son. Every Sunday morning, no matter how busy Marcus became, he made sure to call her, and once a week, Margaret visited the same diner she had been coming to for years. It was her quiet tradition, a moment of peace. On that particular morning, Margaret sat at her usual table by the window. A cup of coffee rested in front of her while the morning sunlight filtered through the glass. She unfolded her newspaper and gently adjusted her glasses. It seemed like any ordinary day, until the door suddenly slammed open. A tall man in an expensive suit walked into the diner with a storm of anger in his expression. His name was Daniel Carter, a wealthy real estate developer who had recently purchased several properties in the neighborhood. Daniel had grown accustomed to power. Money had given him influence, status, and a dangerous sense of entitlement. He believed the world should move according to his wishes. And that morning, something had already put him in a terrible mood. As he walked through the diner, his eyes landed on Margaret sitting alone at the window table. That particular table was the one he wanted, the one with the best view. But instead of waiting or choosing another seat, Daniel felt something darker rising inside him, something rooted in arrogance, something that had been quietly shaping his behavior for years. Without hesitation, he walked straight toward Margaret. The peaceful atmosphere of the diner was about to shatter. Daniel Carter stopped beside Margaret's table and stared down at her with visible irritation. Margaret slowly looked up from her newspaper. She noticed the tension in the man's posture, the impatience in his breathing. But years of life experience had taught her how to remain calm even when confronted by hostility. She simply nodded politely. But Daniel was not looking for politeness. He was looking for control. He believed that because he had money and status, people should immediately step aside when he demanded something. Margaret's quiet composure irritated him even more. Without warning, Daniel slammed his hand onto the table. The loud noise caused several customers to turn their heads. The waitress behind the counter froze. Margaret remained seated, though her hands tightened slightly around the edges of the newspaper. Daniel leaned closer, his face twisted with anger and impatience. His aggressive body language made it clear that he expected immediate obedience. But Margaret did not move. She had spent a lifetime facing people who believed they had the right to treat her as less than human. She had endured worse than angry words. And she had learned long ago that dignity often meant refusing to surrender to intimidation. Her calm silence felt like defiance to Daniel, and his temper exploded. In a sudden, shocking moment, his hand struck her across the face. The sound echoed through the diner like a thunderclap. Margaret's glasses slid off her face and landed on the table beside her coffee cup. A small spill of coffee spread across the surface. For a moment, the entire diner fell into stunned silence. No one moved. Some customers looked away in discomfort. Others stared in disbelief. Margaret slowly placed her hand on the table to steady herself. Her cheek burned from the impact, but her eyes remained calm. She picked up her glasses with trembling fingers. Daniel stepped back, breathing heavily, convinced he had asserted his dominance. What he didn't notice was a quiet shift in the room. Several people had begun reaching for their phones. One of the waiters quickly stepped into the kitchen and made a call. Meanwhile, Margaret carefully wiped the spilled coffee with a napkin. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply sat there with quiet strength. But far away across the city, something else was already beginning to move. Marcus Lewis had just finished a meeting when his phone buzzed. One of his trusted security managers was calling. Marcus rarely received calls during meetings unless something serious had happened. The moment he answered, the tone in the man's voice made Marcus's blood run cold. A message had just been sent to him. A video showing his mother being struck inside a diner. For several seconds, Marcus stared at the screen in complete silence. The room around him seemed to fade. The air grew heavy. Anyone who knew Marcus understood one thing very clearly. He could tolerate many things in life, but harming his mother was not one of them. Within seconds, Marcus stood up from the table. The men around him immediately recognized the dangerous calm in his expression. Orders began moving quickly. Cars were prepared. Security teams mobilized. Within minutes, a convoy of black vehicles was moving through the city streets toward the diner. Back at the diner, Daniel Carter had no idea what storm he had just unleashed. He sat down at the table Margaret had occupied moments earlier. His sense of superiority remained untouched. But outside, the quiet street was about to fill with the sound of approaching engines. The diner's front door opened again nearly 15 minutes later. But this time, the energy entering the room was completely different. 3 sharply dressed men walked inside with calm but unmistakable authority. Behind them stood Marcus Lewis. The atmosphere in the diner shifted instantly. Marcus moved slowly through the room, his eyes scanning every detail. His presence carried the weight of someone used to commanding respect without raising his voice. When he reached the table near the window, he saw his mother sitting quietly again, her hands folded in front of her. The faint redness on her cheek had not yet faded. For a moment, Marcus's expression tightened with emotion. Everything he had built in his life suddenly felt insignificant compared to that single mark. But he kept his composure. His men quietly positioned themselves around the diner. Daniel Carter looked up from his seat, irritated by the sudden attention surrounding him. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Marcus turned toward the manager and calmly requested the security footage. Within minutes, the video played on a phone screen. The entire incident unfolded clearly. Daniel's aggression, the slap, the humiliation. Marcus watched every second. The room was silent enough to hear the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Daniel finally noticed the tension surrounding him. For the first time that morning, uncertainty crept into his thoughts. Marcus slowly turned toward him. There was no shouting, no dramatic threats, just a quiet, controlled presence that made everyone in the room uneasy. Power does not always need to be loud. Sometimes it simply exists. Daniel began to realize that something was terribly wrong. The man standing before him was not just another customer. This was someone whose influence stretched far beyond that diner. And Daniel had just crossed a line that could not be undone. Marcus finally stepped toward his mother and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Margaret looked up at her son with calm eyes. Even in that moment, she remained the same composed woman she had always been. Marcus understood immediately what she was silently asking. She had spent her life teaching him that true strength was not about revenge. It was about dignity, justice, and control. Marcus turned back toward Daniel Carter. The arrogant confidence that had filled Daniel earlier was now completely gone. Fear had replaced it. The consequences of his actions were finally beginning to unfold. The story of what happened in that diner spread quickly throughout the city, but the outcome surprised many people. Marcus Lewis did not respond with violence. Instead, he responded with something far more devastating for Daniel Carter: accountability. Within weeks, investigators began uncovering several illegal business dealings connected to Daniel's real estate empire. Financial records were reviewed, partnerships were questioned, hidden violations were exposed. The same arrogance that had allowed Daniel to strike an elderly woman in public had also made him careless in his business practices. Soon, lawsuits began piling up. City officials opened investigations. Investors pulled away from his projects. The powerful empire Daniel had built through intimidation and entitlement slowly began collapsing. Meanwhile, the diner remained exactly the same as it had always been. Margaret continued visiting once a week. The same window table, the same cup of coffee. But now, every person in the diner greeted her with quiet respect, not because of who her son was, but because of who she was. A woman who had endured decades of injustice, yet still carried herself with dignity and grace. Marcus also changed something in his own life after that day. He began stepping away from the darker parts of his power. His mother's quiet strength reminded him of the values she had always tried to teach him. Power without integrity meant nothing. And the greatest legacy anyone could leave behind was not fear. It was respect. Margaret never spoke publicly about the incident, but her story became a powerful reminder throughout the community. That dignity is stronger than hatred. That arrogance eventually destroys itself. And that every person, no matter their age or background, deserves respect. Sometimes the people we underestimate carry the greatest strength, and sometimes the consequences of cruelty arrive in ways no one expects. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel Black Legacy for more powerful stories that remind us why respect, justice, and humanity still matter.